So as we've really touched on, it's a thing of within any sort of economic system, the one of the central debates is always about what should the role of government be, because human beings, obviously, like left to their own devices, there will be inequality, and some people will naturally accrue more money, and some people will have less. Right? It's not as simple as saying the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's largely a myth if one looks into the statistics. Typically, it's a thing where like all levels of income steadily rise over time. Sometimes the rich might get richer at a faster rate than the poor. Sometimes the poor's wages might stagnate, so they might stay the same for a long time. They might dip a little bit, but broadly speaking, the economy grows, and people at all different levels of the income scale do rise with that over time. But it's a thing of people question about what the role of government ought to be, because should we have a more hands-off government which kind of just lets the marketplace do its own thing, or should we have more state intervention? So as we mentioned earlier about taxing more to reduce income inequality, to spend money on different things, or is too much interference in the market counterproductive? Does government intervention end up leading to inefficiencies? Does it end up leading to more poverty? So these are some of the things we're going to look into in this video. Now, there are essentially four strains of economic thoughts, and many of these we will go into more depth in future videos when we talk about political theory, because economics, philosophy, and politics are very neatly intertwined. That's why in many elite universities they have PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics. And many elite people who in government studied these kind of courses, right? I didn't. I was able to study politics, but I wasn't able to get the grade for that. But I still have a decent understanding of all these things. But so the main different strands of economic thought are Marxist, corporatist, basically social democratic. One could also call it Keynesianism, and then you have what's known as free market / laissez-faire economics, right? So laissez-faire is French. It basically means like you're kind of free to do whatever you want, basically. Not exactly what you want, but kind of so on one end of the scale you have Marxism, where the government owns the means of production, they control the factories, they control everything. Like everyone works for the government, and all industry or everything is owned by the government. And in that system, there is no private property. Everything is owned by the state. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, with laissez-faire economics, you basically have a system where people are, the market's not really interfered with too much, and people can basically do whatever they like within the confines of the law. So within Marxism, for instance, if we look at examples like the Soviet Union, like Cuba today, etc., what we end up seeing with, so the state controlling lots of different things is good in some ways, in the sense that it ensures that people are covered for the basic necessities in life, such as healthcare and education, etc. On the other hand, it's a thing of everything, even down to the extent of whether you're allowed to drive a car, or even to the extent of in Cuba, if you have a toaster, the government will allow you to have a toaster only if they can work out that it will be a net benefit to everyone on your street. So everyone within your community, if you have a toaster, can at any point be like, oh, sorry mate, I need to use the toaster, right? So that's the kind of, so if you have on that extreme and in places like Cuba, while they do have some of the best doctors in the world, it's a thing where, and one of the highest proportions of doctors in terms of population anywhere in the world, it is also a fact that many doctors have to moonlight on the side. So they have to, a doctor can in Cuba make more money being a what do you call those people? The people who like stand at the doors and hold the doors open for you. I can't remember the name. Not valet. Kind of a valet, basically, right? Doorman. Yeah, doorman. There we go. My brain just got. So you can make more money being a doorman in Cuba than you can as a doctor. You can make more money being a taxi driver, yeah, driving tourists around, than you can as a doctor. So while there's good things in systems, there's also some negative things, right? So this is some of the things we're going to explore, some of the other theories. Right, so the next one we're going to look at is corporatism. So corporatism is, so the way to think about it is, this is mainly typified in more authoritarian countries, such as like your fascist countries, Nazi Germany, all these kind of places, but also places that were a bit less extreme than that, but still, so in a corporatist society, it's a thing where private businesses are technically allowed to run, but it's a thing of how they operate and what they have to produce is dictated by the government. So the government goes, right, you're not selling cars anymore, you're making tanks for us, right? For instance. So there's a thing of there's a veneer of private property ownership, but in reality, the state does still control everything. So in that system, it's quite difficult to think of good things for that. People used to say, for instance, the common thing people used to say with like in fascist Italy, people would be like, well, at least the train runs on time. So yeah, there's not much to say about that. I mean, it's a lot of those systems will try their best to focus on like getting rid of employment. Getting rid of unemployment. And so they'll put lots of like money into sending unemployed people to the army or to weapons factory, etc., right? So yeah, I'm trying not to let my political views come through with this, but yeah, it's quite difficult to make some pluses for this. So yeah, but anyway, definitely look more into corporatism, and hopefully you can find some more positive things potentially. Right, so the next one we're going to talk about is Keynesianism, right? So this is typically the kind of so Keynesianism and laissez-faire economics, which is what we'll get into in a second, both of those systems are what you typically see within liberal democratic states, right? So we've moved away from the authoritarian, like dictatorship and stuff. Now we're moving into, we live in a free society, right? So within Keynesianism, there will be some industries that will be nationalised, such as railways, etc., etc. So certain like utilities and certain industries that are seen as key to the national interest or the national well-being of its citizens. These things will typically be nationalised. So if they're nationalised, it means that they're run by the government, supposedly on the behalf of the citizenry. And under Keynesianism is the belief of, as we mentioned earlier, about having progressive tax rates. So taxing wealthier people at a higher rate than people at lower rate. That doesn't mean that if there's a 60% tax that they're taking 60% of your wealth. It means 60% of your wealth above a certain rate. So that's essentially what marginal tax rates is. We'll get into that at another point as well when we're talking. There'll be a video about taxation, so we'll go more into depth on that then. But typically with Keynesianism, you will have high tax and high spend government. So yeah, the government will tax a lot, but then they will use that revenue to spend money on education, on healthcare, etc., etc. And Keynesianism, named after John Maynard Keynes, famous economist, and the belief was that it doesn't really matter too much if you end up running into what's known as a budget deficit. So if the government spends more than it takes in from taxation, that's okay. In the same way as if you were going to buy a house, you'd have to take out a loan for the mortgage on that. So a little bit of debt is fine as kind of in the Keynesian eyes, and it doesn't really matter too much about balancing the budget as such. So that essentially summarizes Keynesianism. And finally, we're going to look at free market economics, or laissez-faire economics. So this is more typified with so if one can think about it within a liberal democratic sense, yeah, the more liberal slash left side of the spectrum on economics tend to lean towards Keynesianism, whereas typically the more right-wing people on economics, yeah, so not talking about social issues, just on economics, yeah, typically these people will lean more towards laissez-faire economics, right? So with that, it's a thing of the government pretty much does like it enforces property rights, and that's pretty much all it kind of does, yeah. And there's obviously a whole range of debates about how small the state should be, how how little the government should tax and spend. Typically, these people will have a lot of emphasis on keeping taxes very low, keeping spending very low, and keeping deficits either at a minimum or non-existent. Yeah, they want the government each year to spend less than what they come in from tax, because they don't want national debt to grow. So they're known as fiscal conservatives. So they try to be very frugal with the amount of money that it kind of is, right? So examples in the world of a Keynesian system would be something like what they have in many of the Scandinavian countries. So in Sweden, in Denmark, these kind of places, they have more of a social democratic or Keynesian perspective on economics. And somewhere that has, places that have more laissez-faire approaches to it would be somewhere like Singapore, places like Hong Kong, and Switzerland, and many other places around the world, right? And even within, if you think about the US versus the UK, within the UK we have the NHS, we have welfare state, we have lots of different components, yeah, that lean us more towards the Keynesian side of things, whereas within America, most most health coverage is in the private sector, and so there's an example of how America leans more towards having a kind of laissez-faire system, right? So when we think about the difference between Keynesianism and free market economics, yeah, this is really well typified by the debates that Keynes had, yeah. So Keynes, British economist, very prominent around the late 20s and early 30s, and you had Friedrich Hayek, who is an Austrian economist, yeah, from the same period, and both of these two men came from completely different schools of thought in terms of how the government should respond to the Great Depression, right? So for those who don't know, there was a big stock market crash in 1929, just as there was in 2008, just as there is likely to be in 2020, given how volatile everything is with the current crisis. And throughout your lifetime, there will be many recessions, right? And each time there is a recession, there's always the constant debate about how the government should respond at a time of crisis like that, right? So Keynes was saying that the way to get out the Great Depression, yeah, was for the government to increase its spending, right? Because remember, one of the components of GDP is government spending. So the idea is increase government spending, then that steadies the market, that gives people jobs, right? It boosts confidence, because for Keynes, he believed in everyone having he believed in markets being run by what he called animal spirits. So when there was a bull market, that's when the economy is doing well. When there was a bear market, that's when things were that's when the economy was doing badly, right? So he said that in a bear market, right, if you increase government spending, you'll boost confidence in all these things, you'll increase investment, you'll increase consumer spending, the entire economy, in theory, should be boosted up. What Hayek was saying is that this is the wrong way of approaching this for two main reasons. Yeah, there's many other reasons, but the two main reasons. First of all, um, for the government to get money, they have to first take it from somewhere else, right? So if they are spending this extra money, it means that they either have to raise tax or they have to do what's called inflation, where the central banks will print lots of different, will like print a lot of money, and they'll spend it and stuff. Yeah, but the thing is, sometimes that often leads to inflation, and this is something we're going to get into in one of in one of the later videos. Actually, we can probably do it in the next video. Actually, talking about the debt crisis, right? Which we are currently facing. So, if you have inflation, that can end up, eroding everyone's savings, but it can also erode people's debts, right? So it's a thing of, it's really good for people who have debts, but it's not so good for the people who have been saving during that time. So it's so Hayek was saying that whatever the government did, it at some point would end up having a negative cost for the for the general public, right? So even if in the short term you might see a boost in things, it would cause long-term problems. And he said that the best way to get out of a recession was to let the markets fix themselves, right? He believed that price signals were a good indicator of that's how the market kind of decides things, essentially. Yeah, so what we pay for prices for things when we buy them, all the labor that's gone into it, all the transportation costs, etc., all those different things, right? And if the price for it is too high, then consumers will be less likely to spend. If it's low, then people will be more likely to spend, right? But if the government comes in and essentially distorts those price signals, makes it either cheaper or more expensive than they otherwise should be, then it ends up leading to inefficiencies, and the market doesn't fully know what the actual price of said product should be, and then you can end up causing a lot more problems. So if you just leave the market alone and just let things sort itself out, then the market, you might have a few years of recession, but eventually the market will correct itself. And in the meantime, what people ought to be doing is save and invest, because he focused more on long-term thinking rather than short-term thinking, right? And if you really want to know, in a much cooler and more exciting way than I can really give credit, than I can really do justice to, right? I would really highly recommend watching the Keynes versus Hayek rap videos. This is from about 10 years ago. They're absolutely brilliant. You don't have to be an economics nerd to really love them, and it's entertaining, and it will really allow you to get a good grasp of the thing. So I'll put a link in the description, right?